Well, hello and welcome to Midweek Minute. And I want to pick up on something that I did not get to cover Sunday morning at Hopes Point Baptist Church in Shelbyville. I made mention to you last week at the end of this broadcast that I had accepted an opportunity to be the interim pastor there for 3 months, March, April, and May. And so for those of you in the area, I'd love to see you come and visit with us if you're not intimately tied into a local church somewhere already, or if you're just able to get away on a Sunday. Hopes Point Baptist Church, Shelbyville, Indiana. You can Google it and get all the information. In fact, what I'm doing and have been doing for a long time is placing these messages on their website, and then of course connecting it to my Facebook, so it's on theirs and mine, 2 different ways that you can get it. But I brought a message at the request of Pastor Ed Moore, whose last Sunday was the last Sunday of February, and then my first Sunday was this past Sunday, March the 7th, filling in his absence. And he had asked me going into the year, would I bring a message based upon his reading of my book that you can order on Amazon Prime, that's titled Disappointment, Deal With It. Now, I had a couple of people say it just seemed like a very harsh way to mention disappointment in the context of like deal with it. You know, what I meant was that if you do not deal with disappointment in your life, it's going to deal with you. And that's what's happening in the life of these Jewish people who are in transition from Egypt and hundreds of years of harsh bondage and slavery to their Egyptian oppressors. They've cried out to God for relief. God has heard them. He's raised up Moses. Moses is God's delegated authority in their lives to lead them not only out of Egypt, but into Canaan, the promised land, the land described as flowing with milk and honey. And of course, as they exit Egypt, you can imagine the relief and the revelry. And I love in the scriptures here that says they rode out with a high hand. And I couldn't help but think of high fives everywhere that day as they're celebrating, exuberant about the reality. They're leaving this harsh culture behind, and they're moving to a country that has been promised to be flowing with milk and honey. So they started great. Most of the time we have great fast starts in our life, but it's in the process along the way between point A and point B that many times we begin to encounter disappointments in our life. And those disappointments can either be used, if we properly respond to them, to develop us spiritually, or they can be debilitating if we choose not to respond and to grow through them. And one of the reasons I'm told that Israel should have gotten to the Canaan land in about 12 days. And we all know it was over 40 years before they got there. Choosing many times the debilitating aspects of disappointment along the way rather than seeing as his appointments, God's appointments, to develop them and mature them along the way to prepare them for when they got to Canaan. Because in reality, they were not going to get to Canaan and just sit down and do nothing. When they got to Canaan, they were going to have to fight their way through the different tribes and territories to conquer and that land for their own. And, you know, God had to develop them for that, but they resisted the development. And many times that's us. We want an easy life. We want to stay in the comfort zone. We don't want any change or any challenges. And as a result, we stunt our spiritual growth in our life. So as they're moving out, their first disappointment in Exodus 14 and 15 was too much water, the Red Sea. They complained. They wanted to go back to Egypt. Then they get out through the Red Sea at God's hand, Moses' involvement, and they get into the wilderness of Shur, and there's no water, so they go from too much water to not enough water. They finally get to into Marah, and they find water, but it's undrinkable water. And as a result, there they are again, just absolutely becoming very debilitated by those disappointments in their life. And disappointments are intricately tied to expectations. In fact, one of the dictionaries describes disappointment as the feeling of dissatisfaction that results when your expectations are not realized. And that's why David gave us advice in Psalm 62 that our expectation must come from the Lord. And so I want to remind you of that when you find yourself in a situation or with someone that there's disappointment in someone or something along the way. Is it based on your expectations or God's expectations? And that brings us to chapter 15. And this is where I left off in the message. I want to touch base on it because this coming Sunday, I want to outline a clear path to the people of that church and to all who will be watching online. A clear path out of disappointment. How do we get disconnected from disappointment and continue to move forward under the leadership of God and His delegated leadership in our life? But when they came to Marah, the water, they couldn't drink it because it says it was bitter. Now I thought about this and I thought, is this the first moment that these Israelis encountered bitterness? Absolutely not. We go back to chapter 1 of Exodus and we find out they were very acquainted with disappointments and bitterness in life as a result. And it says in chapter 1 and verse 14, and that the Egyptians made their lives, the Israelis' lives, bitter with hard bondage. So they were carrying over, this emotional response network in their minds and spirits and souls and bodies based on years of debilitating disappointments and resulting bitterness. And unchecked disappointments in our life, unrealistic expectations of others, including God or those closest to us, co-workers or whatever, will lead to bitterness in our life left unchecked. In fact, what I found here as I studied this journey of Israel from Egypt to Canaan was the fact that each time they encountered a disappointment, they lost focus of who God was and who they were. They lost focus of where they were going, which was ultimately Canaan, the promised land, and how they were going to get there. And so we've got to stay focused in the midst of disappointments upon the Lord, our identity of who we are in Him, and trust His guidance to get us to the ultimate arrival place. So we see that there was an application of a tree into the waters to turn it sweet. I think this is a great allegorical connection to the cross of Jesus Christ. It's described as a tree in two different Galatians, and Peter also uses that to describe the cross. Of course, the cross was hewn from a tree. And as a result, we see that the cross is always the starting point in our lives to deal with disappointment, defeat, our depraved nature, whatever it is in life. The journey spiritually begins at the cross, but it doesn't end there. Paul made it very clear that the cross is integral to our everyday lives. Jesus said, take up your cross daily and follow me. Paul said, I am crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live. And you know what he says in the remainder of Galatians 2:20. So we see the application of the cross to this bitter situation was the beginning point of beating disappointment in our lives. And then I want to close with just some thoughts out of two New Testament passages. In Hebrews chapter 12, it says in verse 12, therefore strengthen the hands which hang down, and the feeble knees, and make straight paths for your feet, so that what is lame may not be dislocated, but rather be healed. And it says when the water was applied to these, or the wood was applied to, the tree was applied to the waters, I'll get it out in a moment, that it turned the bitter waters sweet. And it brought healing to the waters. The waters were healed. And when the people drank of the waters, we see the symbolism. Pursue peace with all people and holiness, without which we will not see the Lord. But verse 15 particularly, and I won't develop it very long, I challenge you to get into this study. Looking carefully or diligently, lest anyone fall short of the grace of God. The grace of God is wrapped up in the cross and our experience and our encounter with the Christ of the cross. And there are many references from Paul about what the effects of the cross are in our lives as believers. And lest any root of bitterness and unchecked disappointment will allow the root of bitterness to develop and grow and sprout a lot of fruit into our lives that's very destructive, very divisive. We see that played out in our culture, our country today. We see it played out in the home today. We see it played out in churches. And we're wondering how to fix the fruit of it, but what's at the root of it? And in this case, bitterness. It springs up, causing trouble, and by this many will be defiled. What he's saying in essence here, it will bring turmoil into our own personal lives. This root of bitterness will zap our energy, our joy, our vitality, our ability to relate rightly to God and to others, to keep the right attitude, to stay focused, to get to the final destination. And listen, hurt people hurt people. And as a result, unchecked bitterness will cause many to be defiled. It'll mess up your relationships. It will absolutely divide and destroy the relationships that you have with those around you. Then how do we resolve this? Ephesians chapter 4, and I'm done. Paul says, therefore, putting away lying, let each one of you speak truth with his neighbor, for we are members of one another. Be angry, do not sin, do not let the sun go down on your wrath. Give no place to the devil. Listen, the devil is aware that we're most vulnerable when we're disappointed. And he will foster that bitterness and accentuate it. It says, let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth, but that which is good for edification, that it may impart grace. That's where that word grace is here. Grace. It says, don't fail the grace of God. We must activate that grace of God in our lives. And it says, do not grieve the Holy Spirit, by whom you are sealed for the day of redemption. Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and evil speaking put away from you with all malice, and be kind to one another, tenderhearted, forgiving one another, even as God and Christ forgave you. So how do we activate this grace in our lives to deal with those who disappoint us? We exercise grace. We receive the grace. As Jesus forgives us, then we forgive others as he forgave us. How do we deal with disappointments? We bend to the power of the Holy Spirit of God, who will give direction and the dynamic to keep moving forward. Listen, keep moving forward in the grace of God, and you'll see his blessings every day. God bless you. Take care.